Putting into words why Eureka 7 is a special anime is a deeply personal affair to me. I think that my experience with it will be different from someone else's, but I still believe it's one of those rare shows that offers something for everyone. Eureka 7 is simultaneously a personal journey, a collection of personal journeys, and also an experience with broader appeal. You might even almost call this a universal appeal. Hi, I'm Staffan. I want to tell you about why I like Psalms of Planets Eureka 7, the seminal 2005 through 2006 mecha anime by Studio Bones. It's a series that's probably familiar to anyone else who stayed up late as teenagers to catch Adult Swim, the late night programming block on Cartoon Network. A TV slot in which Bones has had a significant stake over the years. A stake which has, like no other before it, made a lasting impact on Western anime consumption. Eureka 7 centers on Renton Thurston, a teenage boy who lives between school days reading about the exploits of the sky surfing anti government group Gecko State. Renton's adolescence is leading him nowhere special until one evening, the world's oldest mech, the Nirvash Type 0, crashes into Renton's home with its pilot, a mysterious girl named
Eureka.
Not far behind Eureka and the Nirvash comes the military, intent on taking out the Nirvash before it can be awoken to its full power. This course of events lands Renton aboard Gecko State's flagship, the Gecko, giving him a chance to make his mark on the world, to rise as an equal to Gecko State's mythical leader Holland, and to help Eureka realize the full potential of the Nirvash and overthrow the corrupt military regime. Stop me if you've heard any of that before. Children and giant robots is not exactly a new premise in anime. It may come as no surprise either that Studio Bones was founded by former members of Sunrise, one of the single most influential animation studios both in Japan and the world at large, and the creators of Mobile Suit Gundam. Oh yeah, that whole Love Life thing, too.
It's joke.
Mecha is a matter of heritage for Studio Bones. A lot of the studio's earliest productions were mecha anime, and a lot of them were really good. A lot of staff on Eureka 7 have pretty major credentials. There's a ton of credits here for the 1998 legend Cowboy Bebop. And one of Bones' first projects as an independent studio was collaborating with Sunrise to make the Bebop movie. Eureka 7's writing chief Dai Sato wrote 3 episodes in Bebop, 9 and 14, the Edward episodes, and then episode 23, Brain Scratch. Something I found interesting about all 3 episodes he wrote is that besides heavily featuring the most annoying character in the series, each of them deals with hunting down the identities of people wanted for committing acts of self-assertion. The bounty heads in Sato's episodes are all people dealing with loneliness in one way or another. Brain Scratch in particular stands out as a commentary on the intoxicating allure of television and electronic media in the blossoming age of the internet.
Do you want to know the greatest and also the worst device that humans ever invented? It's television. Television has created a people who believe instantly in dramatic fantasies, who can be controlled by tiny dots of light.
Working under Sato on E7 was Ichiro Okochi, who wrote some of the most impactful early episodes of Eureka 7, and who previously was also scriptwriter responsible for Turn A Gundam, 08th MS Team, Planets, and Bones' own Razafon. Storyboard and key animation staff also included the director of Cowboy Bebop, Shinichiro Watanabe, along with a plethora of other staffers who worked on Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta Gundam, Gundam Wing, Evangelion, and also contributing to mechanical design was Shoji Kawamori, who wrote one of the best episodes of Cowboy Bebop, and everything in Macross. When it comes to Sunrise and to Gundam especially, much of the staff's prior experience shows in Eureka 7. In both its basic premise and length, E7 resembles 0079 with a mix of the attitude and tone of Zeta Gundam. And I think where this shines through the most is in the characters. A lot of personalities and roles can be compared and contrasted between the two franchises. Gundam is one of my favorites as well, right up there with Eureka 7. I think Universal Century is a marvelous franchise on its own. and I strongly believe it deserves the decades of success it's enjoyed. Gundam's compelling. However, early Gundam is, by design, predominantly a war drama. The plot moves as a consequence of decisions far removed from its cast of reluctant soldiers. And this is fine. Gundam is a story full of character and heart that remains unique to this day, but a character-driven story it is not. If anything, early Gundam's strongest focus is, perhaps a little cynically, on the mecha themselves, and in particular on the mechanics involved in their operation. Mobile suits have an in-universe field of science dedicated to explain their function and to justify their existence. After all, realistically speaking, what role does a tank with legs fulfill that can't be better handled by a tank with treads? There aren't a lot of good answers to that, and Gundam director Yoshiyuki Tomino knew this. So an entire reason to exist, an entire reason for convenience had to be invented. Gundam perhaps put hard sci-fi into vogue in anime, and quite a few mecha after Gundam followed suit in trying to justify themselves. Not Eureka 7, though. In this world, they mine these machines out of the ground, strap rockets to them, and prop them up on giant surfboards. When limbs are knocked off, veritable geysers of blood shoot out of the chassis. They can even transform into cars. These aren't so much machines as they are living things that people are jamming into the shapes of road vehicles. And whose bright idea was it to use the same magic keys on normal motor vehicles? These compact drives aren't very practical. Does your car need to read your thoughts to run better? This is a show that is wholly and unapologetically unconcerned with making you think that its world and mechanics are even remotely feasible, or at the very least, practical. And yet, despite that, it sucked me in. Week after week. It gripped me tight. Every episode, the Gecko's travels took the crew some new and strange place, with new and strange people, each living in ways they could only live in this odd, coral-shaped landscape, yet with which we can still empathize and relate and eventually understand. Gecko State's enemies aren't faceless either. They're officers and soldiers with ambitions and dreams too, and when they fight, there is a lasting impact. There's no bad guy of the week that comes and goes. That's not to say that Eureka 7 doesn't have villains. It does. Some are definitely more noteworthy than others, but there is a noticeable lack of abject evil for the sake of evil, for the most part. If anything, however, the central antagonist is the world itself, the nature of that world, and the society which dominates it, a society which refuses to let things change, a society which, in more ways than one, would rather crumple in the current than ride the waves. Speaking of riding the waves, the animation here is fantastic. This show first aired in English back in 2006. It was phenomenal. The in-universe sport of lifting and the culture around it are born from careful study of surfing, with a hint of skateboarding. It's pretty obvious some hard work went into understanding how people move when balancing themselves on a board, and it really pays off. E7's most unique feature is also one of its most fun features. The sorts of shows that filled the programming blocks meant for children didn't have this sort of grace, let alone the budget to pull it off in the first place. This was the sort of thing that made kids want to break the rules, dive into the real action you saw in late-night anime on Adult Swim. Kind of makes you wonder if that wasn't the point, actually. Just as important as the animation itself, though, is the composition of each scene, and here's where the direction shines. This punctuates the highs of animation and covers for the lows. The ways the camera moves and how the scenes are framed remains interesting and varied. You don't see just pans and shot reverse shots. Consider, for instance, how, in the early episodes, Gecko State's photographer Stoner is tagging along in the backseat of Matthew's Type R606 to take pictures for the group's magazine Rayout. And so early on, a lot of the camera work during the mid-air fights is candid and comes off as a determined cameraman squeezing the action into frame. Holland's first on-screen kill gets the sort of burst mode photography you'd see in sports magazines. When Renton comes speeding on screen to deliver the Amita drive, we freeze on the exact moment he passes up Holland like a racer crossing the finish line. Little things like this make it fun to follow what's happening on screen. The weaker animation can be masked with good camera work. I love just about everything about this show. The animation is marvelous, the design is unique, no character looks generic. The predominantly electronic soundtrack is simultaneously bumping and emotional and is used to stunning effect. Following the writing is like surfing a wave of emotion, with exciting peaks and heartfelt dives. Remembering the twists and turns brings me to tears a decade later. It also has a pretty serviceable English dub, starring Johnny Young Bosch opposite Stephanie Sheh. Funny how that works out. So if subtitles aren't your thing, you can always catch it in English. It's really hard for me to find things to complain about with Eureka 7. A lot of that is certainly down to my state of admiration. Despite this show running for a whopping 50 episodes, the usual suspects are hard to come by. Animation quality is fairly consistent, though you will spot a shot or two that doesn't look exactly superb. And you'll notice them reusing the Nirvash's launch sequence a couple of times. That 50-episode runtime gives the show time to pace itself, to establish itself comfortably while letting events happen. That pace picks up when it needs to show us action and desperation, and slows down when it needs to hone in on important details. Filler is even non-existent, barring one spectacularly dumb episode really late into the series where everyone's brains turn off, and they forget about the tension simmering in the literal background and they stop to play soccer. But then, as if nothing happened, the series picks up where it left off and storms ahead to an extraordinary ending. I still maintain Eureka 7 is a great show. It begins in a way that is, in the current era of anime, a hard standard, but yet still refreshingly full of warmth and enthusiasm in the way it introduces itself. And as time goes by, Eureka 7 surprises you more and more with an absolute flourish of storytelling. And if you're concerned with spoilers, you should take it from me that this is a good show. Leave it at that, and consider watching it. Up until now, I've been very careful to avoid plot-critical information, but for the remainder of this video, I'll begin to dig into the show, its plot, and its characters, so go forwards at your own peril. Now then, here's a question for you. Have you ever been in love? Have you ever been in love without really thinking about what that means? Have you ever been comfortable with the person you love? Have you ever been unsure of whether someone loved you back? Have you ever had an innocent love? Have you ever had to spend a long, long time away from someone you love? Have you ever thought that you didn't deserve someone else's love? Have you ever had to watch the person you love waste away? Have you ever still loved someone who didn't love you anymore? Have you ever loved someone who just didn't care? Someone you loved so bad it hurt you to see them hurt themselves? Someone you wanted to be with? Someone you wanted to help? Someone you wanted to save? Or maybe someone you wanted to save you? Alternatively, have you ever just wanted to be a really big asshole to your siblings? All these and more are questions Eureka 7 asks its viewers. Love in all its forms are important here. But just as important as love is the maturation of love. Eureka 7 is also about growing up, from a fleeting, childish longing for companionship to a blossoming romance, coming to grips with your adulthood and accepting responsibility for yourself. I think one of the biggest things that makes a show or book stand out to me is the notion of nuance in the work. This can mean a lot of different things and occasionally conflicting things, especially in my case, but I find that with Eureka 7 there's a sense of impact that goes beyond the superficial, even though the superficial can just be taken at face value. I like when something has layers. On the surface of E7, you have a fun mecha action show. Below that, you have a coming-of-age story. Beneath that, you have a vibrant declaration that love triumphs over violence. And then beneath that is a groundwork of references and genre homages. In getting this across, I think that the single most important aspect of Eureka 7 is its characters. Nobody in this cast goes undeveloped. To nobody's great surprise by this point in the video, couples are a prominent aspect of Eureka 7. And I like the couples in this show. They're what I would call good. Each romantic pair has something different going on. That romance isn't the end-all be-all of these characters, but it goes a long ways towards establishing that magical thing called theme. In fact, you can even think of the conflict resolution by the end of the story as the planet coming together with humanity. That's the ultimate waifu right there. This is not to say that everybody is necessarily well-developed. Frankly, Dewey is flat as far as main antagonists go. He exists to put people on edge, to soak up the viewer's hatred, and to be the guy who wants to destroy the world. His motives are not respectable, and his methods are irredeemable, namely wholesale mass murder to manufacture a crisis under which he can stage a coup to gain the necessary control over the military apparatus to destroy the sapient life form which covers the Earth and initiate a cosmological change that will consume all life in a black hole. There really was nowhere for Dewey to go in the story besides straight to the grave. Just think, I've asked 3 different people if they remember Dewey, and the first thing that came to mind for all 3 of them was the creepy leg thing he does to the sage lady. Ah! What exactly is the deal with that book Dewey's always reading anyway? The Golden Bough by James George Frazer is an early anthropological study of world folklore and religions from the year 1890. It's a weighty text centered chiefly around building a case for a bizarre Roman ritual which is said to have been a normal occurrence at the sacred grove of the goddess Diana in the forest of Nemi in the hills of southeastern Rome. The priesthood of Diana at Nemi took part in a rite of combat open exclusively to escaped slaves. If a runaway slave could break a bough from the central tree of the grove, He could challenge the priest in a fight to the death for his office and for the title King of the Wood. The overall significance of the Golden Bough in Eureka 7 is either really basic or is really hard to summarize, and it's worthy of its own in-depth analysis. But of exceeding interest is the suggestion by Fraser that, in a certain sense, the Nemi priests were married to the sacred tree of the grove. Among other things that were downright scandalous to a Victorian audience, Fraser contends by a lengthy list of examples that modern cultures and religions vestigially retained an ancient belief in sacrificing the power of a kingly figure. The immediate implications of Fraser's arguments are relatively straightforward. Dewey and Holland's family, the Novaks, were the sacrificial kings of the forest, taking part in a ritual based on what is described in the Golden Bough, designed to appease the planet by way of sacrifice. The son always killed the father and took the title. When Dewey improperly tries to perform the ritual and kills his father, a violent tectonic shift occurs, and the nobility places blame for this upset of nature on the Novaks' failure to properly follow their rites. Years later, Dewey identifies Adrock Thurston as the new scientific king, for not only uncovering the true nature of the scub coral which covers the world, but also for sacrificing himself to save the world during the Summer of Love. Maybe Dewey envied Adrock. That's certainly very possible. One thing that stands out about Dewey is that he contrasts against the heroes of the show because he is somebody who is not really loved by anyone for who he is as a person. Adrock, after all, was a father who sacrificed himself because he loved his children, while Dewey drove himself into a sacrificial ritual, perhaps partly because he doubted his father loved him. Not that this is a very good reason to kill one's dad. Maybe it's an urge to fill that parental void that drives Dewey to surround himself with orphans, little orphan girls that he conditions to be psychotic killers in his crusade for world annihilation. But if the bad guy is the worst aspect of Eureka 7, it should come as little surprise that the best examples of the show's characterization lie in the main characters, Renton and Eureka. Renton works well as a protagonist because we watch him genuinely grow through the series. He starts off as a naive little boy, dreaming of greatness. He seems to think that wanting for something is all it takes to succeed, and he learns, one painful step at a time, that this isn't the case. Some of the things he does early on are downright embarrassing to watch. In many ways, the first half of the story is about shattering his ideals. We see this again and again and again. He came aboard the Gecko fully intent on proving how incredible he could be to the legendary genius Holland, only to realize that the man known as Holland Novak is a grouch who bums around in his underwear all day. Not long after Renton comes aboard, he discovers that Gecko State is so thoroughly strapped for cash to fund their lifestyle that they're willing to take jobs from worse than shady sources. Nobody even bats an eye at the fact that they put a child in charge of a cooler full of harvested human organs. Eureka starts off as an emotional blank slate. Feeling is not alien to her, but she does not understand it. Indeed, the fact that nobody has seen her laugh before she met Renton is significant. Eureka is also self-sufficient at the start of the series. She's the only one who can pilot the Nirvash, at least sufficiently anyway. Renton is more or less a hanger-on who can only ever desperately pine after her. But as time goes by and the situation unfolds, Eureka begins to struggle as a pilot until finally, in a desperate moment, the Nirvash permits Renton to be its pilot so he can save Eureka. For all his best intentions, Renton's efforts to win over Eureka fall flat because he's too immature to see beyond his own little bubble. When things start to sour between the two of them, he assumes it's because she's jealous that the Nirvash is letting him pilot it, and that he seems to be piloting it far better than she ever could. But Renton being Renton, he fails to see that his actions have consequences. Eureka isn't upset with him for piloting the Nirvash well. She's upset with him because he's using the Nirvash to butcher people. Renton is so thoroughly caught up in his childhood construction of reality, his delusion of self-importance, that he doesn't realize that LFOs are built to kill people. And so, like a child, he runs away from that realization, until two people make him realize that he has to own up to his actions.
Freedom is something that you need to actively acquire. It's not something that's given with no strings attached. To be free means to take responsibility and prepare yourself for what's to come. Understand, Renton?
And thanks in no small part to those two, Renton grows up and forges an honest relationship with Eureka, while vowing to learn from his mistakes and be a better person. Ray and Charles Beams are only on screen for a relatively brief time, but the impact that they have on the show is unforgettable. Their ship, the Swan, offers a mature, composed, and uplifting contrast to the downright depressing lifestyle of the Gecko. Charles is open, upfront and honest with himself and Renton about his way of life, and Ray is eager to protect and provide for Renton. When the couple sees that Renton is alone, they make a genuine effort to welcome him into their home. And when Renton turns down their offer, they don't try to trap him. All they say is that he needs to do what's right, and then they let him go. They see him off. And later, they die putting up genuine fights. Charles gets his final duel with Holland. The two settle their score. Except for how haunted Ray is by the Summer of Love, it doesn't feel like there was any genuine malice, just cold, hard resolve to see things through to the end. The lesson the Beams family imparts on Renton is to take responsibility for himself and for his actions, and to carry out what he's started, for his sake, as much as for the people around him. Given the turning point that Ray and Charles present in the series, it shouldn't really come as a surprise to hear that Renton's arc is simply adulthood, though it's an arc we see paralleled elsewhere in the get-go. Holland is a character for whom, even as a child, I felt a certain amount of sympathy. I know that some people find it hard to look at him positively because of how he behaves for the first 30 episodes, and had I been a little younger, a little less receptive than I was when I first watched Eureka 7, I would have probably agreed. Holland is a jerk who only ever takes action at the last second. He finds it easy to ignore his problems and quickly resorts to physical punishment because he doesn't know how to handle Renton's naivete. But he also takes things personally, and it eats away at him. Holland is a good character, not because he does good things, far from it. Holland's a good character because he's an absolute wreck of a human being. He's an adult, closing in on the halfway point of his life, and yet he acts like a stubborn brat. And Holland is haunted by his past, by the things he did and the things he didn't do. Gecko's state is the product of his need to run away from his responsibilities. And mirroring Holland's plight is Talho, the Gecko's pilot and Holland's second in command. Talho's relationship with Holland is complicated. In the first few episodes, we get the clear picture that the two of them are romantically involved, but they bicker and argue like a couple on the brink. Talho is perhaps the most mature of the two, and in many senses, Holland relies on her to act as his conscience. But Talho is also quick to anger. She's bitterly jealous of the attention Holland gives to Eureka, and drinks heavily to stave off her problems. More than anything else, she's frustrated with Holland's lack of momentum and decision. The sheer distance the two put between one another is painful. I always felt that the problem in their relationship arises from the fact that Holland doesn't think he deserves to be loved, while Talho just wants to be needed. Holland and Talho have a much more mundane relationship than Renton and Eureka, a very adult relationship with very petty, very adult problems. After all, the two came together rebounding off of different failed romances. And I think the beauty of this couple stems from the fact that they struggle to adapt, and they struggle to improve as people. And yet, knowing this, they persevere in the hope that they can eventually succeed in finding happiness. Their flaws make them realistic. I maybe hinted at it a little strongly earlier, but out of all the fascinating characters and heartwarming couples in Eureka 7, my favorite pair still remains Dominic and Anemone. Dominic and Anemone are a strange parody of Renton and Eureka. They even contrast visually and behaviorally. Theirs isn't a straightforward or gentle story. There's nothing about them that's really normal, like with Talho and Holland. Their situation is unique, but beneath that skin of absurdity, that absence of relatability, I still found something that I sympathize with, even empathize. It's a story of compassion. Anemone is an artificial copy of Eureka, designed to take her place and pilot a hideously powerful new LFO. Dominic Sorrell is an intelligence officer and enthusiastic supporter of Dewey. When Dewey is released from prison and reinstated into the military, he entrusts Dominic with the care of Anemone, whose precarious existence as an artificial Corallian makes her dependent on a deadly cocktail of drugs to even let her pilot her machine. Anemone is unhinged, volatile one moment and melancholic the next, desperately eager to validate herself to Dewey. She doesn't even seem to care about the consequences of her actions. Her little world revolves around herself and her pet Gulliver. Yet, despite this, Dominic still worries after Anemone, and he falls hopelessly in love with her mercurial state of being. Dominic's blossoming feelings for Anemone put him at odds with his master Dewey. At first, it's just a pang of regret as he helps carry out the Colonel's plans. But as time goes by, Dominic sees the effect that drugs and the withdrawal from those drugs have on Anemone. He begins to realize Dewey regards not only Anemone, but everyone around him as a means to an end. And when Dominic finally discovers the truth behind how Anemone was made, just as it was with Renton, his ideals are completely and irrevocably shattered. But whereas for Renton, growing up meant collecting himself and thinking things through, Dominic realizes adulthood by taking matters into his own hands, by doing something he knows is absolutely stupid in order to see Anemone again. And it's because of this that their reunion is one of my single favorite scenes in this series. I've heard it said that apart from adulthood, Eureka 7 is about being one with nature. I don't quite think that this is it, though. After all, the Scubs aren't exactly nature. Maybe you can say that the Scubs have supplanted nature. But the thing is that the Scubs want to coexist with humanity. Eureka 7 is filled with people who come to realize that they can overcome their problems by learning to share burdens with someone else. Couples are an important part of Eureka 7. It's a series about learning to coexist and cohabit. All of this goes a long ways towards me saying I love Eureka 7. I really do. I loved it growing up, and I love it now. And I think, maybe, just maybe, you might like it too. Bones and Bandai have tried many times to recapture the essence of the original broadcast anime, with everything from a sequel to compilation movies to tie-in games to a manga adaptation. There's even a trio of films to reboot and retell the stories coming out over the next couple of years. Maybe it's just my bias talking, but nothing they have done with this franchise ever since it began has succeeded in approaching the quality of Psalms of Planets Eureka 7. And that's why I think it's worth talking about now, a decade later. Growing up, I was really lucky I had this show. This video has gone on far, far longer than I ever intended it to go, and I'm not sure that's a good way to start a YouTube channel, but there is a lot to talk about with this show. And I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching, and I hope you can come to love this series as much as I do.